Hi, this is Benoy Thanjan, your host of the Solar Maverick podcast, and also the founder and CEO of Reneu Energy. Reneu Energy, we're a solar developer and consulting firm. We've developed more than 100 megawatts of solar projects across the US, and we help clients execute clean energy projects with confidence. We act as your owner's rep, overseeing developers, EPCs, and financing partners to de-risk your project and keep it on schedule. We also provide development as a service, supporting origination strategy and execution so you can advance projects without building a large internal team. On the renewable energy credit side, we offer REC brokerage, REC asset management, and custom renewable energy credit research, helping clients understand pricing, policy shifts, and long-term market dynamics. In addition, we provide new market analysis and financial modeling to evaluate opportunities, assess project viability, and support investment decisions. To learn more, reach out at info@reneuenergy.com. That's info at reneuenergy.com. We'll also have information on the notes of the podcast as well. Let's get into it.
When it comes down to it, the energy business, every energy source is subsidized in one way or another and always has been. Sometimes that comes and goes and there's ups and downs. So you really have to have a thick skin and be disciplined to be in the energy space, because the landscape just does move under your feet. And really only if you're disciplined in your operation and you're adaptable and agile and able to change as the situation changes, only then are you able to cut through all this and see it through to the end.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it.
Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick podcast. I'm really excited to have again on the podcast Dorian Hunt. He's the partner and head of renewables at Leo Berwick, and he actually was on episode 231 to unpack the safe harbor rules. We got such great feedback about that interview that we brought him back to talk about FEOC. I'm sure it's something that he's been talking to a lot of clients about. It's foreign entities of concern related to renewable energy projects in the ITC. Dorian, welcome back to the podcast. I appreciate you making the time today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back. It's great to see you again. And yeah, FEOC, foreign entities of concern, limitations as it relates to renewables projects are really a hot topic and an evolving topic. And there's lots of rich detail to think through and talk through and navigate. So I'm looking forward to doing that with you today.
Yeah, definitely. So this interview is taped March 24th, 2026. I'm just saying the dates because everything seems to always be in flux, and we received the preliminary, I guess, guidance to FEOC on, I think it was February 11th or 12th. And that's not the final guidance. That's correct, right?
So that's correct. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense to put a timestamp on these things because the situation does change so rapidly, and we get little bits of guidance here and there that cover some things, but not other things. And maybe, in the future, when we get proposed regulations, final regulations, the certain things will be addressed and resolved. It's a constant exercise to stay on top of it and to make sure that we're guiding our clients in the right direction in terms of how to navigate these rules.
Yeah, definitely. What would be great maybe is to start off the podcast with talking about your background and what Leo Berwick does. If people didn't listen to the
Sure.
previous podcast, I think that would be very helpful.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I am partner, head of renewables and energy transition tax at Leo Berwick. We're an energy and infrastructure focused advisory firm with practices that execute in tax, financial due diligence, integration and separation, valuation, cost segregation, state and local taxes, and tax insurance, all focused on energy and infrastructure. So we're really carefully curated team of professionals with various skill sets that spend our days helping deals get closed, executed, and putting energy on the grid, helping enabling manufacturing incentives to be procured and clean fuel and all that good stuff. And so for me personally, I've been in this role for about 2.5 years now, but I have 20 plus years experience structuring joint ventures for energy projects, doing tax equity and credit validation, and supporting my clients with decision analytics and tactical and strategic decisions related to their portfolios.
Yeah, that's a really comprehensive description of what you do in Leo Berwick. I appreciate you explaining that. And obviously, like talking about FEOC is, right up your alley just
Sure.
because of your expertise. And Obviously, things are constantly changing and keeping your clients updated. And I appreciate, obviously, you making the time today. For our listeners who are new to FEOC or foreign entity of concern, how would you explain what it is and why does it matter for solar projects?
Yeah, so foreign entity of concern limitations were introduced as they relate to solar and other renewable or alternative energy projects that could avail themselves of federal incentives. They were introduced as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That's where we got the initial statutes describing the operation of these rules. But what it boils down to is that projects that either get too much of their equipment and materials from foreign entities of concern. And it's mainly China that we're talking about, but Iran, North Korea, Russia. But really, at the end of the day, what it boils down to is understanding how much of assistance you're getting from these foreign entities of concern. So, and there's a few different forms that assistance can take. So it might be about equipment sourcing, and that's certainly part of it, but it's a little bit broader in terms of understanding what the ownership structure of your vendors is. Are there other kind of arrangements that might allow an argument to be made that your project is effectively controlled or is under effective control by one of these foreign entities of concern? So the FEOC rules, I'm going to start saying FEOC because it's easier to say that, but the FEOC rules are effectively three-pronged at the end of the day. It's about equipment sourcing, and we call that the material assistance piece of it. And it's about ownership, understanding whether you're dealing with a specified foreign entity or a foreign influenced entity, and also understanding whether there are arrangements in place that might give those entities effective control over your project. And there's a lot. That third prong in particular is where the most to talk about in terms of the need for additional clarity and where I've seen most of the speculation recently. But if you're found to have too much equipment from a FEOC or have one of these FEOCs effectively have control of your project, then what that means is you don't get those federal incentives anymore. As we're all aware, those federal incentives, things like the ITC, PTC, whatever it may be, in a lot of cases are that make the difference between a project penciling out and not, right? So understanding the accessibility of these incentives and how FEOC limitations might influence the availability of those incentives is just crucial to getting projects done.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great sort of description of the different three prongs. I'm not as familiar with the third prong, which I'm sure, brings a lot of questions to people.
Mhm.
And then, like, we talked about it a little bit before. I mean, you talked about this. Can you talk about like the material assistance piece and really like what is the material assistance for 2026 and then onwards?
Yeah, so I'd be happy to get into that. So material assistance, again, it's about understanding where your components are being sourced from. So if you've had, experience with domestic content rules, then that can help give a little bit of a foundational framework to understanding how the rules around FEOC material assistance in particular operate, because a lot of the initial guidance is based around the methodologies first introduced in IRS Notice 2023-38, which talked about domestic content, and as well as a subsequent elective safe harbor tables that were issued around domestic content. So if you have that baseline level of understanding, then it's arguably easier to navigate really what it means to have material assistance, right? And it's kind of the inverse of the domestic content calculation. Here, we're trying to show that we're in a better incentive position if we're able to demonstrate that we don't have too much of our equipment in the project that has been sourced from one of these foreign entities of concern, right? So in terms of the thresholds, right, the thresholds are all over the place depending on the technology. So there's thresholds for solar, and there's thresholds for batteries, and there's thresholds for mining and manufacturing, right? So there's different percentages that are going to be at play depending on one, the year that you start construction, and two, the type of technology. So the qualified facility is how a solar installation under Section 48 Cap E or 45 Cap Y would be designated. It's the term of art, qualified facility. It's going to fall into that bucket. And if we look at the statute 7701 A52 tells us that for solar, if you have a 2026 start of construction, then the material assistance threshold is going to be 45%. Then in 2026, it's 40%. Then 2027, it's 45%. So effectively, you need to, as time goes on, the requirement to source more and more equipment from non-FEOC vendors is a requirement to be able to avail yourself of these federal incentives. So it's rationing up. Now, if you were in battery energy storage technology, so, if you're in the solar space, perhaps you have co-located energy storage technology, and recall that under 48 cap E, there's a distinction between electricity generating qualified facility and energy storage technology or battery. And the energy storage requirements start higher. So 2026, we're at 55% and so on and so forth, going higher and higher. And I think that there's a bit to talk about the different ways you might calculate those numbers, and we'll get into that. But there's also, as has been the case with these federal incentives for a long time, having a really crisp understanding of what start of construction actually means and how it's defined and how you pursue it is just such a key component of navigating these rules. So, you probably saw that when prior to the start of this year, there was a big push for projects to start construction. And that push was built around the desire to avoid, to the extent one can, these foreign entity of concern assistance, material assistance limitations. And a lot of projects got, accelerated their construction timelines and their procurement timelines or whatever else to, for business reasons as well, but also as a way to get ahead of these rules. And now we're in a different kind of start of construction countdown, where before July 4th, if we're able to demonstrate a start of construction, then we have a longer runway to place these things in service than we would if we were after July 4th. So like so many things, start of construction is a crucial aspect of understanding how these rules might affect your specific project. And those rules were introduced back in 2013 or earlier than that, actually, and have been evolving, and market views have been changing and shifting. But a lot of the basic science around it has remained the same.
Yeah, definitely. That's a lot of information in a short and concise way of saying it, and simply, even though it's obviously very complicated materials. I guess one of the things that keeps coming to my mind is like traceability. Like, how are you able to prove that, these contents are not from China? I know there's been issues at the port. For example, QE Solar, who had a manufacturing facility, and they were saying that the cells and some other materials weren't from China, but they weren't able to prove it. Has there been a lot of discussions about, how you could provide comfort so that obviously you could get the full ITC?
Yeah, for sure. So this is talked to about quite a bit among my developer clients. Okay, how do we get better visibility into what's happening in our supply chains? And I think the notice that came out in February was particularly instructive on how to navigate the material assistance threshold and the sourcing of equipment, because there are a couple safe harbors that were provided in IRS Notice 2026-15. And those are the identification safe harbor and the cost percentage safe harbor. And when you're using, the cost percentage safe harbor, you aren't necessarily digging into, those direct labor and material costs or material costs otherwise that go into a determination of a ratio that says how you compare against those escalating thresholds. Instead, you use currently the new updated elective safe harbor domestic content tables to get a percentage, right? And instead use that percentage to say whether something's in or out. But then the question is, okay, that percentage, how do I know whether the thing to that percentage is attributable to came from, one place or another? And when you're using that kind of tables, this idea that if you get certifications from your vendors, right, that say, hey, this stuff is not FEOC sourced, and you don't have a reason to believe that it's incorrect, right? Then you can have, reliance on that certification for the purposes of the material assistance cost ratio. So I think that what I've seen is kind of across the spectrum in terms of how scrutinized or not those certification letters from vendors are. Like sometimes I've seen a push to really dig into the ownership composition, the fundamentals of those vendors to know really what's happening up the chain and kind of get that certainty as to who holds the equity of the debt, who really has that control. Is it a specified foreign entity? Is it a foreign influenced entity? Taking that certification at face value. So I really think what I've seen is a real facts and circumstances kind of reliance or not on that safe harbor that allows you to depend on those certifications and rely on them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate you going into detail. How about like investors, right? We were talking about developers, but then how do you get investors comfortable, like, and the different types of investors in the value stack? You have your sponsor equity, tax equity,
Mhm.
your debt investor, have all different qualifications on what makes them comfortable to fund
Sure.
the project.
I probably say this phrase a lot, but it's an evolving situation, right? So,
Oh,
there are some things that relate to the determination of the availability of tax incentives that are pretty fully baked. Market views and expectations have been really solidified. But here, I view us as being in the earliest stages of getting our hand around where these rules are going and what the ramifications are for projects, such that, these investors who might be putting money into these projects, some of them are not going to proceed without clarity, without sufficient clarity. And I think right now there's a view among many that, maybe that clarity is lacking in a lot of instances, and that can be a throttle on the availability of capital. And maybe some of those are taking a wait and see to see how things develop. And maybe some that see more opportunity are trying to understand what's really going on at the project level and in the supply chain more deeply to know how the sourcing of those components is, may or may not affect the availability of incentives. So I think it's a mix of approaches between that deep dive and understanding those risks and taking them and being compensated for them and pausing and holding back. And I've seen it all lately. Now, in a lot of, especially since the introduction of transferability, right,
yeah.
tax credit transferability, there's been this boom of the tax insurance industry where tax insurance steps in and covers the event that perhaps something was not put together the correct way and puts, incentives or other aspects of the deal at risk. And a lot of, over the years, the typical covered tax positions, as they call them, have evolved. And I think that as it relates to FEOC, it's that kind of participation of tax insurance, at least from where I sit, has been slow to develop. And I think that's really a function of not having, total visibility into all those rules and what they mean and kind of how broad the reach is of those rules. So I think that there's an appetite for, things like tax insurance to step in and find a place to provide comfort and coverage. But again, that type of understanding the inherent risks is a similar species of investors trying to understand, the risk of putting their capital in one of these projects. And I think depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different answer.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I appreciate you explaining that. That's really interesting to hear all that. And then, too, like, I don't know if you've heard, the expectations of having a certain amount of the material from the US is challenging as well because the rules apply starting in 2026. And when you talk about battery storage, most of it's produced in China or manufactured and built. And then even solar panels still, a lot of the cells, the wafers, the ingots are coming from China. Like,
Yeah.
how is the private sector supposed to move so quickly with these rules when Treasury is coming up with guidance, but realistically, how much of the equipment can be fiat compliant?
Yeah, yeah. Especially with solar, it's particularly challenging and with BESS, right? Because, where are we getting the lithium, right? For chemical energy storage, right? For a battery. And where are we getting the cells? US, we don't have that kind of robust process heat or wafer slicing ability, right? That just really depends on really cheap energy in the first place to be able to, do that profitably. So, and those components of battery energy storage and solar panels, respectively, are just such a huge piece of at least the assigned costs in those safe harbor tables, those percentage costs, that it's difficult to find the compositions of equipment and components that are going to meet the right thresholds. And it's just going to get harder as those thresholds ratchet up. And, to your point about how can the private sector respond? And from where I'm sitting, I think it's really challenging for there to be an uptick enough in those domestic production activities such that you can say, at least domestically sourced equipment, right, is available as an alternative to FEOC. And then, then it begs the question of, okay, let's say that we do have domestically sourced equipment, how much more expensive is that going to be? And what does that do to project economics, right? And, is that so much more expensive that, it cuts into the value proposition of the incentives? Now, with ITCs versus PTCs, maybe that's an easier conversation to have, but it's something to be considered. Now, I mentioned advanced manufacturing before, right? I think that's a crucial piece of this. Advanced manufacturing, 45X credits in particular, built with the idea of increasing that domestic production activity for these pieces of equipment. But I think that given the timelines we're working under, I think it's, even with the best intentions and kind of permissibility and fast tracking, it's very difficult to put manufacturing kind of infrastructure in place that can serve the demand that needs to be fulfilled for these projects to get built and for us to have the power as a nation to feed our energy demands, a lot of which is being driven by things like data centers and AI that are just sucking up energy faster than, maybe we had anticipated, when these ideas were new.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's interesting because load growth really has not grown for a long time, and things have obviously changed very quickly
Hmm.
with data centers and their requirement for energy. Also, the other thing that I could see happening is certain developers having access to fiat compliant equipment, more notably like the bigger developers, because they have more of a balance sheet, they could buy more product. So I feel like there would be a preference to certain developers getting the fiat compliant material compared to others, you know?
The bigger you are, right, then the more flexibility you have to navigate the supply chains. I mean, yeah, a variant on the same old tale that hey, if you're in that position of power, you're just going to have more flexibility to make the best of these rules. And you're probably more likely to be able to get those products built with complying equipment. But also, on the other hand, if you're of a certain size, then the irony of it is that, maybe your cost of capital would be so low anyway that you can make these things pencil out without the incentives, right? So,
Oh, that was my next question.
what I see, it really particularly puts the pinch on small and medium-sized developers, for that reason, at least. But also there's the issue of there's a new kind of 10-year recapture exposure we have, right?
Yeah.
For the investment tax credit in particular, and like universally, applied across all project types and stakeholders. But I've always viewed it as particularly effective for the smaller developers who, benefit to a greater degree from, more incentive right away up front, right? But
Yeah.
with the new 10-year recapture, which I can talk a little bit about, related to payments to entities that have effective control, if foreign entities of concern, what that does is it more difficult to understand how investors and stakeholders generally can get comfort with ITCs, knowing that there's a possibility that these new recapture rules could come into play and cause a clawback, which, to me is suggestive that in a lot of situations, maybe the production tax credit alternative for a qualified facility could be a way to mitigate that recapture risk. But if you're not one of these big players that has the wherewithal to wait out the delivery period of a PTC, then is that tactic really available to you? Right. And probably practically in a lot of cases, it's not.
Yeah, that is such a great point. I appreciate you talking about that. I have talked to some large IPPs, and especially when you talk about community solar, which is usually a higher margin project because you're taking a discount to retail rate versus a utility rate, or they're talking about not even wanting to use the ITC because the margins are high enough for the return.
Hmm.
It's high enough. And then obviously you have other costs related to the ITC, as you mentioned, like there's
Sure.
legal fees and other structuring
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
fees.
that's right. And the uncertainty
Gosh,
of that
yeah.
10-year tail of the recapture, right?
Yeah.
So all these rules are, they have introduced a lot of complications, but I do think that it is important that, we want to do what we can as a nation to protect ourselves against things that are happening globally that could interrupt our access to energy at the right cost. Right. So, it's whether it be oil and gas and what's happening, conflicts abroad that might cause instability or spikes in price in the same way. I do think, FEOC rules can be viewed as well intentioned to try to avoid, similar type of exposure to entities, those entities of concern that we don't necessarily want having influence on our energy and our ability to use it, given that at the very least it's so closely correlated to GDP, right? That tight coupling, suggests that our energy usage, I'm not sure it's causal. If those two were to GDP and the energy usage were to deviate, I'm not sure that would an outcome that's favorable, for the nation.
Yeah, definitely. I think the big issue is how quickly the rules are changing and changing quickly and adapting, and it's hard.
It's hard. And the slowness with which they come out, right? So
Yeah.
we got this notice 2026-15. That's helpful in certain respects, but really all it did was spend a lot of time on the material assistance piece of this, the equipment sourcing, but it
Yeah.
didn't give us really much of anything on ownership and effective control and how we navigate those things. In some cases, it's crystal clear, right? But in a lot of cases, I think most cases, it's not. And now we're left waiting for guidance on those second two prongs, ownership and effective control. And, I think the only thing we learned about the notice is that when you have licensing and royalties like intellectual property rights, a specified foreign entity, then that's going to be considered the bad kind of effective control, right?
Yeah.
So, but that's not much, right, in terms of all of the questions that, my clients have and various, investors and debt providers and insurance providers have with respect to this market.
Yeah, I think the challenging thing is, right, the executive order was like 2 days after July 4th of
Mhm.
2025, and then
Yep.
it took February 12th, 2026 to get the first FEOC round of guidance, and it
Yep.
applies to 2026.
in that first round of guidance, I mean, I'll take, some guidance over none, but it looked a lot like what we already knew about how to apply domestic content rules, right? In terms of, so necessary to understand and parse and work through, but from where I'm sitting, not really earth shattering or revelatory.
Yeah, definitely. Like I know we're waiting for more guidance on like, control, obviously, like ownership, right? And then can you talk more about like what effective control is?
I can talk about it, but I tell you, it's a lot of speculation, right? Think about it as anything that could, and there's a list of things along these lines in the statute, but anything that could give one of these FEOCs the ability to control, like whether you operate your project, to whom you sell your energy. That's pretty broad. You can think of a lot of things. So, like, the example I use a lot is things like software, right? Firmware that's built into your equipment, like that. Let's say you have one of the a foreign source piece of equipment, and part of the equipment relies on you paying some sort of software licensing fee, right? So you can actually access, the guts and change the behavior of your system. If somebody, a FEOC vendor, effectively has the keys to shut that off or brick you, right? And then I think is a good argument that that's effective control, right? From that lens. And then there's other, maybe more nuts and bolts style arrangements, things like long-term service agreements, right? To say, hey, this, in order for this thing to operate, we have this LTSA in place, and these maintenance activities are performed under the contract and keep these projects afloat. So if that LTSA were deemed to be an effective control arrangement, what do you do? Do you separate yourself from that and go find, another long-term service provider? And are they going to be able to do the job that needs to be done as effectively, as competitive a cost as you would have had, with the original contract in place? It's things like, I think we right now lacking clarity. I do think we need to think broadly about all of the arrangements, whether they're in the main contract themselves or just implied, right? That could fall under this effective control concept, which again is about, permission or ability to operate your project and to whom your power is sold.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you giving some guidance based on your experience and what you've seen. I know obviously it's still to be determined. And then there's no real time frame, right, of when we'll get more information on the other two components.
I'm hopeful that when we have the expectation of proposed regulations to come
Yeah.
out, but before the end of the year, and I think that hopefully those will address, more of these issues in a way that's satisfactory and at least provides, clarity on what the rules are. Because what I find has the most chilling effect on development is not understanding where the rules are going. Nobody wants to be left holding the bag, realizing that the game has changed in midstream, and all of a sudden put skin in the game for a position that's no longer tenable.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. I think a lot of people are frustrated because it's hard to make decisions. And then obviously you're putting skin in the game. You could be, as you said, on the wrong side of it pretty quick.
Yeah, yeah. When it comes down to it, energy business, every energy source is subsidized in one way or another and always has been. Sometimes that comes and goes and there's ups and downs. So you really have to have a thick skin and be disciplined to be in the energy space, because the landscape just does move under your feet. And really only if you're disciplined in your operation and you're adaptable and agile and able to change as the situation changes, only then are you able to cut through all this and see it through to the end.
You're right. I mean, it's definitely obviously a lot of companies are obviously having financial issues because of it, and companies that continue to survive, and that's because of creativity and coming
Yeah.
up with solutions, and obviously not taking big risks when on the other side. So,
Sure, sure. Yeah. And in hindsight's 2020 for everybody.
for sure.
And it's hard to know what the right decision would have been, what decision you would have made if you had all the information. But I do think that there are tried and true kind of methods you can apply on a daily basis, to anticipate these storms. It's around that discipline and the view of all the different paths you might be able to take at any given point in time, whether it's revisiting your supply chain or your vendors or project composition overall. You can be best served by, always being in that vigilant state of realizing that the rules of the game can change and sometimes there's ambiguity, and trying to outmaneuver those complications in a way that differentiates you and your projects.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great response to that. I mean, that's a great suggestion, obviously, and feedback related to basically adjustable to whatever situation kind of comes to.
Mhm.
I know we talked about like uncertainty and gray areas in the current guidance. Is there any things that we haven't talked about as far as gray areas?
Yeah, so I think that for the most part, it's about those effective control and ownership pieces are, I think, where we need the most clarity. I think that as it relates to ownership, just understanding maybe whether there can be limits on how far up the ownership chain we need to understand, like how much transparency we really need. Like, are there going to be safe harbors for that aspect of it, safe harbors for effective control in this? And I'm optimistic that we will see some kind of safe harbor, just if for no other reason than for the reason of administrability, right? Because even if the safe harbors aren't necessarily exactly what you wanted, at least it's something to hang your hat on and say, okay, I took this position and it's clear as day I'm not in the soup because I'm just appealing to, this guidance that came out and I checked all the boxes and I followed all the steps. I am optimistic that those safe harbors or some variant of that is going to be available in connection with ownership and effective control. And I really think that's what it's going to take to unlock the activity here so it can live up to its full potential. And the reason I'm optimistic, of course, is that for so many of these tax credit determination crucial aspects, startup construction, which I talked about a lot, and then domestic content, and now the material assistance cost ratio for FEOC, we have a handful of safe harbor that we can, find comfort in for all those things. And I think that's an indicator, perhaps that's a trend. And like I said, for administrability, but also just to get projects done, that those are on the horizon.
Those are all great points. What should developers be doing differently right now to stay compliant while keeping projects financeable? I know you talked a little bit about
Yeah,
it.
if you have a collection of projects, which many developers do, that started construction prior to the start of this year, do what you can to charge through and get those online, producing energy, as quickly as you're able, realizing that many out of your control to do so. But then, as we look toward the future, I think it's really going to be a question of the personality and kind of risk appetite and prognostication of certain developers to understand whether they think it's going to be profitable to like lean in and, take positions based on where they think the law is going to go, kind of staking position there. Or maybe there's, especially if you have those kind of legacy pre-2026 started construction projects to focus on, thinking about, how to best execute on that and having your attention on that while we wait for additional clarity around FEOC. So I think that there's always something to focus on, right? Something meaningful that can move the ball forward. And I think for every developer, they need to look at the array of activities into which they could be putting their energy and their focus, right? And kind of prioritizing, some of those over others and prioritizing those ones that are more clear cut in this sense, and maybe deprioritizing the ones that aren't as clear cut as a way to pragmatically get things done and get those projects on the grid while enduring the wait until we get the guidance that's going to, provide clarity on the ability to navigate FEOC effectively, as opposed to, for example, applying, the consistent pro rata level of effort to all your potential works as, you may have done in the past.
Yeah, that is great advice. I appreciate you walking through that. And you were last week at the InfoCast Solar and Wind Power Investment Conference, which is the largest, I think, finance conference in Phoenix, Arizona. You actually, I think, moderated a panel on FEOC, right?
I didn't moderate, but I did show up. But it was really a productive panel, great conversation with my fellow panelists, and well moderated. And it was no surprise that there is a lot of confusion and concern about what the implications of these FEOC rules, might be for particular projects and how to get around them and how to adapt to them. And I think that I see a real just hunger for clarity here that's just growing and growing. And I think that that's the trend we're going to keep seeing, just as that stable of, pre-2026 starter construction projects, it gets built and put online. And, there's going to be additional pressure to navigate these rules in the right way to avail yourselves of these incentives when it's necessary for the deals to pencil out. Yeah. So FEOC was a big topic of conversation. And like you said, that big, well-attended conference. And a lot of times people at those conferences are so busy doing meetings that they don't show up to the sessions. But what I observed is that anytime FEOC was being talked about at sessions, that I was standing room only.
Interesting. That's great perspective. And then were there any sort of big takeaways that you had either from the sessions or your meetings?
Yeah, I think the big takeaways were, what I'm seeing is just not, in terms of like advisors providing, tax opinions or tax insurance stepping in to provide coverage on these things. There's a mixed bag, and there is, I'm not seeing a lot of consistency, an appetite to either write those positions, those memoranda, or bind those policies, whatever it might be, to help to mitigate the optics of the risk. And I think that what I've seen is really we're in this kind of nascent stage across the board of every stakeholder trying to figure out where we're all going to collectively, land and how the market viewpoints are going to emerge so that, we can get back to stamping out deals more consistently, more confidently, without ambiguity.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you sharing that. And then has your thoughts on FEOC changed with the conflict with Iran, or is that totally independent?
I don't think it's independent at all. I think everything's interrelated. And as it relates to the conflict, I mean, what I see is, as it relates to energy, of course, focusing on that is that it's another example of these physical kind of things that interrupt the supply of oil and gas, right? It can just, immediately tumultuous behavior in energy prices here, right? And elsewhere. And I think that really punctuates for me, the need for us, from a national security perspective to find all the channels whereby, those global conflicts and other global activities might influence our either access or affordability of energy, and trying to prevent that type of exposure just because it is so crucial to our well-being. And FEOC, to me, as difficult as it is, and maybe, I have some criticisms on, the way the guidance has come out and, the exact mechanics of it. But like I said before, I do think that there's a well-intentioned idea here that if we are going to be a nation that is not subject to these calamities and affecting, the pocketbooks of Americans, then, we need to look really carefully. Where are we getting our lithium, our cells, our wafers, our ingots, and where are we getting our equipment otherwise? And what kind of control do these foreign entities of concern have over our generation and our delivery? And what can we do to get ahead of that? And I think that it's really time of growth, learning, and pivot, and it's absolutely necessary as the world around us changes.
Yeah, definitely. That is great. Is there anything about FEOC that we didn't talk about that you think is important for our audience, the Mavericks, to know about? I mean, it's been pretty comprehensive.
I've said what's on my mind. I think every day, clients come to me with additional concerns and questions, and we're just here doing what we can to effectively, guide our clients in our view what the best way to navigate these problems is. So, I'm sure later this afternoon I'll get a question I haven't heard before, and there'll be another item to talk about. And I'm always available to chat about these issues if you'd like to, reach out again.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing I would say too is we don't know really how much the government's going to enforce any of these things and whether
Mhm.
they have the resources to enforce it. I mean, that's been a big issue with the IRS because the staffing has gone down a lot. So they have been auditing less,
Yeah.
tax returns. So I don't know, is that something that people have been talking about or?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Some folks, take that perspective. And, that's why I kind of mentioned how important administrability is, right? Because the only way a meaningful, volume of projects could come under a level of scrutiny that's worthwhile is if the systems are in place, like, for example, with these safe harbors to make them, easier to navigate. Well, now, I always take the view that I always try to assemble my projects and guide my clients as if an audit is going to occur,
Yeah.
to say, how can we best position ourselves, if this were to occur, to make sure we're all buttoned up and we're not waiting for, so a notice of adjustment or a notice of audit to come to us. We're building ourselves to best comport with the law as we understand it and as it's written so that our projects are unimpeachable and in the best position. But practically, sure, it is a question for me as well. How much of this can possibly be really analyzed in the level of detail that's required to say that there's an issue? Some audit issues are easier than others, and I think this is among the harder one in this space that I've seen.
You know what I thought was interesting on the US IRS audits was that they tend to focus on small business and the middle class
Mm.
because if you go after, people who have more money, they have the capabilities through their legal and advice and other experts
Yep.
that it would take a long time for them to be able to. Part of me thinks the same thing could potentially happen.
Could happen. And again, I think that just like always, the little guy loses because, as I intimated, I kind of see FEOC as a practically, an attack on ITCs more than PTCs, and ITCs
Yeah.
are, better for those smaller and mid-sized developers. And again, always, if you have the balance sheet to fight the fight, to wait it out, even waiting out interconnection queues, right? Or
Oh, for
anything,
sure.
or being able to amass enough equipment that maybe you can make your deals pencil out, without these incentives, right? Just another example, right, of how, small, medium-sized business, gets the short end of the stick.
Yeah, definitely. I could go on and on about this, especially when you talk about tariffs and other stuff. That's going definitely off topic. Well, I really appreciate you making time to be on the Solar Maverick podcast, Dorian. This was a great interview. If our audience is interested in learning about you or Leo Berwick, what's the best way that they could do that?
Thank you again for having me on this. It's always a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak to you and, indirectly to your audience. If anybody wants to talk to me about this or any other, energy adjacent issues or infrastructure issues, probably the easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn. If I, spot you there and you're reaching out and you have questions, we'll connect. We'll have a conversation. We'll go deeper.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously I'll have your LinkedIn on the show notes, and obviously Leo Berwick's website, and also the safe harboring interview that you did back in, I think it's August of 2025. And nothing's really changed. It's pretty much the same, right?
Yeah,
And everyone's now in a rush, right?
Yeah, that's a nice little archive. I think that at that time we had the note, we were on the heels of that revised start of construction notice requiring, different physical work standard as opposed to 5% safe harbor for above 1.5 megawatts solar and wind. So yeah, we're in the same boat now. But I do think there's a lot to talk about there, even because I've seen an evolution of perspectives on what physical work means. And again, as I said at the opening of this, start of construction is just, has an impact on so much of this.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's interesting how things just are always changing and adjusting. And obviously people are coming up with creative solutions, right, to handle these different regulatory hurdles.
Yeah, for sure.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dorian. I appreciate it. This was an amazing interview, and I appreciate your thought leadership and look forward to more of your thought leadership on LinkedIn. I love to watch your videos, so hopefully seeing more.
Thanks so much for that. Always a pleasure. And great questions. You're really digging into the heart of these issues and what matters. So
Anytime. Thank you, Dorian. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick podcast. The Solar Maverick podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.